Hello and welcome back. In this episode I'm going to show you how you can containerize a Postgres database and have that database running within a Docker container rather than having to install Postgres onto your local machine and have it running in the background of your local machine. So what we're going to want to do first of all is open up the Docker Hub and navigate to the Postgres Docker image. You can see we've got it here like so. And if we scroll down at the time of recording, we can see that the latest version is 13. So what we're going to want to do back in Rider is create ourselves a new run configuration. So clicking on the plus to add a new configuration, if we scroll down, we can select a Docker image from the list. And the image ID or name is going to be Postgres. And that's going to be version 13. You can see our autocomplete there, Postgres version 13. That basically tells Docker to look for the image called Postgres, which is this image here. And it looks for the tag or version 13, which we can see here is the latest version there at the top. Now, we're going to want to initialize a couple of options when we are creating this container. So if we scroll down to how to use this image, you'll notice that they specify a Postgres password as an environment variable. So if we copy that environment variable, and then we can say modify options, and we can say environment variables, and we can specify a new environment variable. And because we're running it locally, we will simply use a password of password. Again, if you're running this and not locally on your laptop, especially in production, you want to use a secure value here instead of just password. We can specify OK, like so. And if we come back to the Docker Hub page for Postgres, we can see the default user is just Postgres, so we need to remember that for later on. And if we pop back into Rider, we want to bind the ports. So by default, Postgres runs on port 5432. So what we want to do is open up port 5432 on our local machine into the container port 5432. And what that means is our local host port 5432 will be routed through to port 5432 of the Postgres Docker container, meaning that we will be able to connect into the Postgres container from our local machine. If we hit OK like so, and if we pop back into the Docker Hub page, and if we scroll down towards the bottom, you'll notice that they specify the data directory as a volume. Now this allows us to persist data between runs of the container, because by default, if we don't set up any data persistence, when we destroy the container and then recreate it at a later date, the database and all its data will be gone. So we'd be starting from scratch every time we recreated the container. So what we can do using this default data volume is copy that like so. We can then come back into Rider, we can say modify options, and we can say bind mounts. And what we can do in here, we can specify a host path. I'm just going to call that a DB, and that means that it will create the Docker volume internally within Docker. If you wanted to, you could specify a path on your local machine's file system, and that would then mount the database data into your actual local file system on your local machine. But just giving it a name there of DB means that will be handled just internally by Docker. So specifying a host path there of an actual file directory is useful if you then want to be able to sort of browse those database files on your local machine. We can then specify the container path, var lib, PostgreSQL and data. We can hit OK like so. And now this is our Docker image ready to be created. So what we can do is we can hit apply. One last thing I will do is just name this Postgres, because this is going to be our Postgres Docker image. Click on OK. And if I now click on the Run Postgres button here, you can see it's unable to find the image locally because we don't have the image pulled down locally. So what it's going to do, it's going to go off to the Docker Hub and it's going to pull down the latest image that's tagged with 13 from Postgres. Now you can see here, if we expand our services, we have an image, Postgres 13, like so, and we also have a container here called Eager Lalande. And within the logs of this container, you can see our database system is ready to accept connections. So what we can do in Rider is use the Database Explorer over here on the right-hand side to create a new connection into our Postgres database running within the Docker container. So if we click on New, Data Source, and PostgreSQL, this will bring up a new data source and driver dialog, and we can specify localhost because we connected port 5432 of our localhost into port 5432 of the container. If you specified a different port number, then be sure to specify the correct port number that you've used here in the port box. Next up, user and password. If we pop back to the Docker Hub page for Postgres, we can see the default user is called Postgres. So we can copy that and give it a user of Postgres. And you'll recall that the password we used was simply password. We can specify that password to be saved forever. If this is a production database you're connecting to, you might want to never save the password so that you always have to enter it every time. We can leave the database as this default Postgres database, and let's test the connection. We can see there the connection has succeeded. We're running PostgreSQL version 3.2, which is the latest version that we saw here from the Docker Hub page. Latest tag there of version 3.2. So what we can do now is click on Apply, like so, hit OK, and you'll notice that we now have a database console open on our IDE. You can see down the bottom right the default SQL dialect. We can set PostgreSQL as the default SQL dialect, like so. And that means that if we're ever writing any SQL statements in code, Rider will be able to provide us with specific Postgres IntelliSense for those SQL queries. So with this console open, like so, we are going to want to create a new database. And we're going to call the database Identity Server. And this will be the database that we are going to use to store the Identity Server configuration in. So, executing that command like so, we can see that a database called Identity Server has been created successfully. You can see here over on the right hand side we have our Postgres database, and we now have an Identity Server database. If we clear that console, close it, and if we just close that console session like so, if we now right click on that Postgres database connection, click on Properties, and the database, which is Postgres by default, if we get rid of that and press Control Space to bring up the IntelliSense, we can see now we have a database called Identity Server. If we now test that connection, we can see that we have successfully connected to our Identity Server database within that Postgres server. If we hit Apply and then OK, you'll notice that we now have Identity Server at localhost, our database connection, and we then have the Identity Server database within. So this episode has essentially shown you how you can run a Postgres database inside a Docker container, and that means that you don't have to worry about installing Postgres on your local machine, setting it up, diagnosing any issues that may be running with it on your local machine. It's super straightforward. Simply install Docker, configure the Docker image that we did in our run configuration with the appropriate options, spin it up, get it up and running inside a container, database system ready to accept connections, and you can then use this Postgres database instead of having it running locally on your local machine. I hope you found this episode useful. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.